Hello, world news for Tuesday. We'll start with why the balance sheet recession will not last as long as Japan's. This is for the United States of America, and PragCap doesn't think that you're going to have decades of nothingness. In a recent story, I pointed out that Richard Koo said it was not significant that the USA had been faster to respond to the current balance sheet recession. Now, he was primarily referring to the ineffectiveness of monetary policy during a balance sheet recession and the fact that it doesn't matter how quickly you cut rates or implement QE during this sort of recession. That's Koo's experience from Japan. I largely agree with these comments, but I think it's important to note that the USA has a slightly different form of balance sheet recession and is responding to it with fiscal stimulus, that's government money, more quickly than the Japanese did. This, in my opinion, is unlikely to result in a balance sheet recession as long as Japan's, which is about 20 years, so we hope not. Cullen goes on, our balance sheet recession is a household debt crisis where Japan's was a corporate debt crisis. Important point to make. As I've often said over the years, effective policy needs to focus on households and not banks. This was always a household debt crisis and not a banking crisis. And while America's banks are still distressed, although they're in far better condition than they were in 2008, American business is actually very healthy today, and I think it's proving to cushion the downside during this recession, and I think this is right. The banks are in bad condition, but corporate America is in good condition. The households are in bad condition. Further supporting this theory of a shorter balance sheet recession is US house prices. Richard Koo notes that Japanese corporations were struck by declining asset prices. The fact that they had an equity and housing bubble at the same time served as a double whammy in this regard. The USA, on the other hand, suffered the equity market bubble crash 10 years ago. So the impact in recent years has been more concentrated on the collapse in real estate prices. As I've previously noted, I think the majority of the price declines are behind us in housing. Almost definitely. This is confirmed by price trends in Japan as well, and there's a chart below, but you'll have to go to the link because I haven't gone to it. This should stop the uncontrolled bleeding that has caused much of the imbalances in recent years. In other words, there might be a small bit left in the double dip housing, but it's not catastrophic. Lastly, the USA was faster to implement the all-important fiscal policy that Richard Koo prescribes. Contrary to political fearmongering and claims that fiscal stimulus has destroyed jobs, the CBO and the sectoral balance prove that fiscal stimulus had aided in helping the household sector during this deleveraging. Common sense is all it should really take to understand this, but politics and confirmation bias cloud people's judgments. This recovery has been largely stimulus-driven. It has not been organic by any means. That means it kind of didn't do it on its own. But that is the nature of a balance sheet recession. If government doesn't fill the spending void, the bad decisions of the few who caused the debt bubble end up causing the rest of us to suffer a depression alongside them. And that's what government's there to do, to save the majority, perhaps. I've thrown this chart in, we used it last week, but it's the outstanding household debt as a percentage of GDP for the United States going back to the 50s, and you can see it had two big lots of ramping up from the 80s and then in the last 10 years, and it's only got a little hook down. There could be an awful lot of deleveraging in the US households still to come. These are the sectoral financial balances from an article by Marshall Urbach at Naked Capitalism, Eve Smith's blog, and it's a Scott Fulwiler chart. Look at it as much as you like. Blue is domestic sector balances, red government balance, and green capital account. If we go back to, say, there are two blue blobs going downwards. Those are domestic private sector balances going negative. That's dissaving, spending a lot. So let's go back just 10, 15 years, something like that. So there was blue dissaving, households were spending a lot, deficit and going into debt. So was government. The green on top, capital account, is the money flows. I think we can simplify this to maybe say that's Chinese money coming in, and the Chinese money coming in was being lent to the people and to the governments, and the people and the government were spending it. And now we've got the people not spending it anymore. They're paying down debt with it, and the Chinese money is still coming in, and that's balanced by the government red sticking down that's spending it. Something like that. Krugman over in the New York Times, Italy versus Japan. A question to which I don't have the full answer. Why are the interest rates on Italian and Japanese debt so different? As of right now, 10-year Japanese bonds are yielding 1%. 10-year yields on Italian bonds are 5.75%. I ask this because, in a number of ways, the two countries both look similar. Both have high debt levels, although Japan's is higher. Both have awful demography. In other respects, the numbers, if anything, favour Italy, which has a much smaller current deficit as a percentage of GDP. Indeed it does. So, Paulie doesn't know why these are like they are. We go over to Noah, who has a stab at answering the question and says it comes down to three things in Japan. Financial repressions, a word or expression or two words that we're going to hear an awful lot of going forward. Home bias and dysfunctional equity markets. Although many of Japan's legendary bureaucratic ministries have dramatically weakened in power and prestige since the 1980s, the Ministry of Finance, MOF, is still extremely powerful. Japan's financial system, like many financial systems in Asia, is dominated by large banks. Shock, shock. In order to finance the government's huge deficits, the MOF puts pressure on the big banks to buy lots and lots and lots and lots of Japanese government bonds, the JGBs. This holds JGB interest rates down to very low levels. It also reduces deposit rates on Japanese household savings accounts to zero, since the big banks need to maintain their spreads. They borrow and lend at a higher rate. They need some sort of spread there. So households see JGBs, government bonds, as fairly attractive investments compared to savings accounts, which you get bugger all in. This is less of a factor these days, since Japanese net household saving is actually now quite low. But one professor I spoke with told me that households have apparently been shifting even more money from savings accounts into the bonds, into JGBs, and this is surely what the Western world will do. Financial repression will force everybody, or as many people as possible, into government bonds. Going to Billy Mitchell over in Australia, an MMT King, says there is an urgent need for a new fiscal stimulus in Japan. Presently, it is not a low growth rate that matters in Japan. The problem is that the growth rate is continually being threatened by the private spending contraction and political process that is under pressure from the IMF and OECD and others to impose harsh fiscal austerity. The last thing Japanese economy needs right now is a contraction in public spending, government spending. All the scaremongering about exploding public debt ratios are lies and should be ignored. Ignore the damn lying bastards. The MMT people, the ones that do those accounting identities, seem to have had the answer for a long time as to why, for example, Japanese rates are so low and Italian ones might be high. and people like Krugman and other economists don't seem to have a clue. It doesn't mean they're right, but they have been consistently defending that position and defending it well. Leave it with you. See you tomorrow. Bye.